I remember the heavy days of my youth with a melancholy clarity that comes only from having seen too much hardship in a life that was never meant to belong to me. I was born under a stark, leaden sky in the dark crevices of Mordor, where the Orcish brood was bred for ceaseless labor and endless servitude. In those times, I found myself forced into grueling work that stripped me of both dignity and time, serving masters who valued only strength and obedience over any sense of decency. The Orcs were produced with a singular purpose, and I, like so many of my kin, was condemned to a fate of unremitting toil. I recall waking each morning as the first faint glimmers of a weak sun crept over a bleak horizon, to the sound of our captors' harsh voices, with no thought for the pain that would soon envelop my limbs or the weariness that would settle deep in my bones. I dutifully joined my brethren in the desolate barracks, carved from stone and blasted by the relentless winds of a barren land. Days were measured not by moments of contemplation or joy, but by the endless repetition of punishing tasks that left us both broken and bewildered by our own endurance. I was assigned to the arduous work of quarrying the very stone that constructed the dark fortresses of our oppressors, a task that demanded strength, persistence, and an almost unholy resignation. The labor was an endless echo of drills and hammers, each blow a reminder of our subjugation. Between songs of bitter resignation, we often joked, hoping, even if only in jest, to find a sliver of light in our otherwise dismal existence. Yet, humor was a luxury rarely enjoyed in the shadow of forced servitude. I still recall the sting of the bitter wind as I hefted enormous blocks of rock, the relentless strain of muscles unaccustomed to such cruelty. Every swing of our chiseled tools was a ritual of despair, a sacrifice to those who ruled with cruelty and an unwavering sense of entitlement. There were also the days when our labor was interrupted not by the usual clamor of industry, but by visits from peculiar figures whose presence was as bewildering as it was aggravating. I recall one such instance when a wizard, a being whose very existence seemed unmoored from the realities of our suffering, descended upon our encampment. This wizened figure, cloaked in fabrics that shimmered with an ineffable luminescence, took an almost condescending interest in our daily plight. His words, laced with arcane riddles and cryptic advice, were dismissed by most of my fellow laborers as fanciful prattle. Yet in those moments, I felt the dissonance of two worlds colliding, one of ancient lore and mysticism, where wizards toyed with fate as though it were a mere trinket, and one of raw, brutal existence, where life was measured in the cost of aching muscles and the loss of precious time. When he spoke of destiny and the greater good of our dark endeavors, I could not help but scoff at the irony of relying on magic to justify cruelty. His condescension was as palpable as the very stones we toiled upon, and his interruptions left a lasting mark on my memory, a symbol of the misplaced priorities that marked our era. In the long, oppressive afternoons, as the labor dragged on, and the sun's feeble attempts to warm our hardened hide seemed an affront rather than a comfort, I began to perceive the intricate web of power that bound us. The warlords and captains of our torment were themselves caught in the relentless machinery of ambition and greed. Their commands were arbitrary, a twisted play of authority that left little room for mercy or leniency. I remember standing before one such warlord, a hulking figure with scarred features and a voice that boomed like distant thunder, who barked orders with such force that even the rocks appeared to tremble. To him, we were nothing more than tools, disposable instruments meant to further his own ambitions. The warlord's cruelty was not random. It was systematic, as if each lash and each shout were carefully measured to instill an unyielding terror in our hearts. I often wondered if there was any semblance of humanity left in such men, or if they too had been molded by the same dark forces that drove us into endless subjugation. As days turned into months, and months into years, the oppressive routines of forced labor began to etch themselves deeply into the recesses of my memory. I came to understand our existence as a series of interminable repetitions, where the concept of time was overthrown by the brute rhythm of physical agony and the mental erosion of hope. Yet in some strange way, even in our darkest moments, there were sparks of camaraderie among my fellow orcs. We shared whispered conversations during our brief moments of respite, exchanging stories of our past lives, tales of what life might have held beyond the boundaries of servitude. I would listen to these murmurs with a mix of wonder and sadness, for they served as both a reminder of our shared humanity and a painful acknowledgement that such human traits had been eroded by the ceaseless demands of our overlords. I remember with a peculiar clarity one incident that epitomized the tragic absurdity of our existence. A visiting wizard, whose robe glistened with an almost comical brilliance against the backdrop of our gray, dust-covered lives, decided to offer us a lesson in liberation. His words, spoken in a tone that seemed to imply both authority and pity, floated through the air as if they were promises of a brighter future. Yet to us, his lesson was nothing more than an interruption, a diversion from the drudgery that demanded our complete attention. He spoke of fate and destiny, of secret powers lying dormant within the soul, as if these abstract ideas could somehow counteract the relentless physical burdens we carried day after day. I listened, not because I believed in the magic he espoused, but because even in our misery, we clung to any thread of possibility that might one day lead us away from our eternal servitude. The wizard's words, as he expounded on a realm beyond our suffering, did little more than underline the gulf between his enchanted worldview and our harsh reality. His promises were as empty as the hollow echoes in the stone corridors where we were confined, and I could not shake off the irony of hearing such lyrical interventions in a life that was defined by the tangible weight of oppressive chains and unyielding labor. As I grew older, the constant barrage of forced labor, the ceaseless interference of meddling sorcerers, and the arbitrary cruelties of warlords began to take an additional toll on my soul. There were moments, quiet, solitary moments, when I found myself alone, far from the cacophony of hammers and orders, when I contemplated the strange contradiction of our existence. I was an orc, shaped to be fearsome and brutish in the eyes of many, yet I possessed a heart that yearned for a solace the gods themselves seemed reluctant to offer. In these moments of introspection, I imagined a life unburdened by the yoke of exploitation, a life where the simple act of breathing was not a reminder of endless servitude. Such daydreams were as distressing as they were fleeting, a transient escape from the reality that each breath was earned with excruciating effort, and each droplet of sweat was the embodiment of sacrifice. I remember thinking that perhaps there was an untold irony in our fate, that beings forged in the crucible of brutality might still harbor secret dreams of grace. One particularly bitter winter, when the lands were cloaked in a relentless icy despair, I found myself working in the depths of a cavernous mine, where the very walls seemed to close in on us, with silent, oppressive judgment. The cold was a constant companion, biting into flesh and spirit alike, and the labor was made all the more futile by the ever-present threat of collapse. In this frigid labyrinth, we were required to extract precious ores used in the crafting of wicked weapons and enchanted artifacts, tools that our captors would later use to assert their dominance over lands far beyond our bleak confinement. Each swing of our crude implements was accompanied by the crunch of frost beneath our heavy steps, and the echoing clamor of our efforts was swallowed by the vast, indifferent darkness of the underground. It was during these long, frozen hours that I began to notice how deeply the architecture of our oppression was woven into every aspect of our existence. The very stone we shattered with our labor bore silent witness to the cruelty we endured, a constant reminder that even nature itself had been subjugated to the whims of irrational power. In that environment, our whispered dreams of freedom were met only with the icy laughter of the wind as it wound its way through the narrow, unforgiving corridors. In the shifting shadows of those subterranean prisons, time took on an almost surreal quality. The boundaries between day and night blurred into an endless cycle of monotony, where each moment was an echo of the one before it. I often found solace in the simplicity of routine. Even as routine itself became a source of torment, I would trace the same path to and from my labor station, my steps imbued with a resignation that had grown heavier with each passing day. I carefully observed the minutiae of our surroundings, the small, persistent drip of water from a fissure in the old rock, the way the faint light from a distant fire seemed to dance like a mocking spirit on the wall, the quiet lament of a dying ember in the gloom. These minute details, so easily overlooked by the unburdened, became essential memories that sustained me through the darkest hours. They served as silent testaments to the enduring nature of hope, however meager it might be. Even in an existence dominated by mandatory toil and enforced misery, I discovered that there remained a peculiar beauty in the most unremarkable of details, a beauty that suggested that perhaps our suffering was not entirely in vain. There were times, too, when the oppressive structure of forced labor and the demeaning oversight of our masters would give way to a brief reprieve, a momentary pause in the symphony of suffering that allowed for the emergence of strange human connections. I recall one such instance with a clarity that has refused to fade over the years. We were gathered in a great, dimly lit hall, a space that had been designated as the site for our brief interludes of rest. It was here that I happened upon a fellow laborer whose eyes held a spark of defiant humor, even as they recounted tales of perpetual misery. In hushed tones, we exchanged stories of small acts of rebellion, a shared laugh at the absurdity of our situation. A covert smile directed at the pompous warlord who had once bellowed orders so forcefully that I feared the very air might shatter under his rage. These moments were ephemeral, vanishing as quickly as they appeared, yet they left a lasting imprint on my memory. In the quiet solidarity of our shared suffering, I saw a reflection of my own yearning for a life beyond subjugation. It was a fleeting glimpse of a possibility so fragile that it seemed almost to vanish upon closer inspection, yet it sustained me through the bleak winter of my existence. The presence of wizards, too, added a layer of surreal absurdity to our daily torment. Aside from the aforementioned visiting sorcerer, whose magical pontifications both fascinated and infuriated us, there were others who appeared more sporadically, a motley assortment of enchanters and seers who viewed our plight with an aloof detachment. Their visits were often preceded by rumors of impending change or mysterious tidings from realms far removed from the grit and grime of our daily labor. I once encountered a wizened mage in the early twilight hours, his eyes twinkling with secrets and his tone imbued with an air of grand mystery. He spoke in riddles about ancient prophecies and the inevitable downfall of tyrants, as though our suffering were but a mere symptom of a cosmic balance that could be righted if only we had the courage to understand it. In that moment, I felt a pang of bitter irony as I wrestled with the absurdity of a magical explanation for our very human misery. It was as though the realm of magic, with all its fantastical promise, had been contrived to lend an otherworldly gloss to a reality that was anything but enchanting. And so, while the wizard's words might have kindled a spark of hope in the hearts of some, I could not help but regard them with a measure of skepticism. In the end, it was our hands, calloused and bloodied by ceaseless labor, that bore the true testament to the harsh realities of our existence. Over time, I became acutely aware of the roles we were forced to play in a drama orchestrated by those far removed from the muddled realities of our daily life. Each of us was a reluctant actor on a stage set by ruthless warlords and meddlesome magicians, our lives reduced to scripted performances of misery and endurance. I watched as comrades fell away, each succumbing to the inexorable weight of despair, leaving behind only memories and whispers of what once might have been the promise of an orcish legacy. The bond we shared, though born from shared adversity, was laced with an understanding that liberation was a far-off dream, a fantasy as intangible as the spells muttered by the robed interlopers. In quiet moments before sleep claimed me, I would consider the cruel irony of our circumstances. We were creatures designed to be feared and reviled, yet in our hearts we nurtured dreams of freedom and redemption, a contradiction that made our suffering all the more poignant. I began to chronicle these thoughts in the recesses of my mind, recording each incident and each harsh lesson with the care of a historian, determined to bear witness to the injustices that had defined our era. I believed, perhaps foolishly, that by preserving these memories, I could one day offer a testament to the resilience of our spirit, a testament that transcended the cruelty of our oppressors and the absurdity of a life spent in servitude. In the course of that long and arduous chapter of my life, I was forced to confront not only the external tyrannies that sought to extinguish our will, but also the internal forces that threatened to corrode it from within. Loneliness, despair, and the relentless monotony of forced labor began to carve deep, unhealing wounds in my soul. There were evenings when I would lie awake under the threadbare remnants of a shelter, the world around me a murky swirl of shadows and silent memories. In those moments of solitude, the memories of my past, both distant and recent, would rise like specters, each one a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there was still the faintest glimmer of what might have once been a life worth living. I recalled the simple joys of a childhood that had been all but erased by the harshness of our imposed destiny, the echoes of laughter that once filled even the most barren corners of our existence. Yet each recollection was tempered by the stark reality of our current suffering, a poignant reminder that the passage of time had rendered those early moments into a bittersweet mosaic of what lay beyond the reach of our present despair. As the cycles of season after season passed, I found myself growing increasingly reflective, piecing together the fragments of my memories like a historian painstakingly reconstructing a long-lost chronicle. I began to document the minutiae of our daily routines, the precise angle at which a laborer's head would droop at the sound of the commanding shout, the gentle rustle of fabric as a wizard's cloak billowed in the wind, the deliberate, almost ritualistic pauses between orders that punctuated the day like a morose metronome. In these small, seemingly insignificant details, I discovered a pattern, a narrative of suffering, etched into the very fabric of every day spent under tyranny. I recorded these details not out of any naive hope that they might someday be of use to another, but simply as an act of quiet defiance, a reminder that our experiences, however brutal, were real and deserved to be remembered. In doing so, I found a measure of solace in the belief that even in the face of unyielding darkness, there remained a spark of individuation, a tiny ember of resistance that technology, magic, or force could never entirely extinguish. Inevitably, the specter of change began to loom on the periphery of our lives, heralded by shifts in the winds of our merciless masters and the occasional, unexpected intervention of those strange, improbable wizards who seemed to defy the natural order of things. I recall an episode when, after yet another particularly punishing day of quarrying near the edge of a broken plateau, our labor was abruptly halted by the arrival of a new warlord, a man whose reputation for cruelty was matched only by his curious obsession with the minutiae of administrative detail. He arrived with a retinue of scribes and advisors, their eyes glimmering with a combination of ambition and bureaucratic detachment as they meticulously recorded every aspect of our forced labor. It was as if our suffering were being repackaged and sold as evidence of some grand narrative, a narrative that these overlords believed would one day validate their own brutal reign. I listened, heart heavy, as he dismissed our plights with cold precision, categorizing our injuries, our lost hours of life, and our silent, stoic endurance as mere statistics in a ledger of conquest. Even amidst this dehumanizing scrutiny, I found a bitter, almost humorous irony in the sheer absurdity of attempting to quantify the soul-crushing torment of endless servitude. The warlord's obsession with measuring every drop of sweat and every groan of despair struck me as profoundly absurd, a futile attempt to impose order on a chaos that was, at its very essence, unorderly and painfully organic. Now, as I recount these long-ago days, I do so from a place of quiet resignation and gentle reflection, the passage of time having softened the sharp edges of my memories just enough to allow me a measure of peace. I have come to understand that my chronicle is not merely a record of the physical hardships endured by my people, but also a testament to the strange, indomitable spirit that exists even in the most unlikely of hearts. In the silent interstices of my recollection, amid the dust of shattered stones and the echoes of lost dreams, there remains a quiet resilience, a subtle determination to remember, to record, to bear witness to a history that was written in pain, yet colored by fleeting moments of human connection and dark humor. I think back on the wizards, so blissfully detached, yet inadvertently interwoven in the fabric of our misery, and the warlords who played their roles with theatrical cruelty rather than genuine malice. I consider how, in their own way, they too were caught in the labyrinth of power, a maze from which there seemed no escape for anyone, be they forced laborer or the tyrant himself. In my waning years, as I sit by the fragile glow of a solitary candle in a lonely chamber, far removed from the whirring chaos of my youth, I allow my mind to drift back over those long, arduous days. I think not with bitterness, but with a gentle, wistful longing for the clarity of a time when every moment was etched in stark contrasts of pain and survival. There is a certain comfort in the act of remembrance, a slow, deliberate recall of that era when every forced day was a constant struggle against both nature and man, when even the ceaseless presence of meddling sorcery and autocratic rage could not entirely dim the small, persistent glow of shared human longing. Each recollection, no matter how painful, is a reminder of who I was and who, in a quiet, imperceptible way, I still remain. I have come to believe that in the endless cycle of enforced labor and arbitrary cruelty, there is an odd kind of poetry found in the resilience of a spirit that, despite being bound by chains and battered by hardships, still found a way to endure and even dream. In the midst of the harsh clamor of daily servitude, I discovered the gentle cadence of our collective existence, a refrain that spoke of shared sorrow, intermittent humor, and a quiet hope that one day, perhaps the pages of our story might be read not as a dirge of despair, but as a testament to the small, enduring sparks of a spirit too tenacious to ever be truly extinguished. Now, as I consign these memories to paper, I hope that future generations, however different their struggles may be, find in our tale a reminder that even in the darkest corridors of existence, there lies within each of us the capacity to reach for a fragment of light. I remember innumerable nights when the cold, indifferent stars bore witness to our silent laments, nights when the distant, eerie glow of a forbidden magic would shimmer gently on the horizon, stirring a faint hope in our battered hearts. Even when the world around us seemed a mere assembly of obstacles and enforced orders, it was in these ephemeral moments that I found solace, a brief interlude during which the ties of oppression slackened and the soul was allowed to wander, if only for an instant, in the realm of possibility. It is in this quiet remembrance that I inscribe the story of my life. As an orc forced to labor under the relentless march of tyranny and enchanted misfortune, as an unwilling participant in a history dictated by powers both arcane and brutal, and as a humble witness to a time when even the most unyielding oppressions could not entirely smother the human-like spark of hope that, despite it all, flickered stubbornly in the darkness. The recollection of forced labor is as integral to my being as the very scars that adorn my weathered hide. Every shift spent hauling stone, every weary day in the forgotten mines and barren fields, every disdainful glance from a high-born warlord or a lofty wizard, each of these experiences has woven itself into the tapestry of my long and troubled journey. I confess that there were moments when despair almost overcame me, when the weight of endless servitude seemed too great to bear. Yet in the solitude of those moments, I would catch a glimpse of a familiar comrade's determined eyes, or the fleeting whisper of a shared joke that resonated with absurdity in the face of overwhelming adversity. I came to understand that in our own unremarkable way, such gestures were small rebellions. They served as a reminder that while our bodies might be shackled by the chains of imposed labor, our spirits, quiet, persistent, and remarkably human, were never meant to be fully subdued by the tyranny of fate. Looking back now, with the benefit of hindsight and the slow wisdom that accompanies the passage of many long years, I realize that our suffering was not without its lessons. The masters who reveled in our misery, the wizards who interjected their arcane philosophies into our arduous tasks, and the warlords who dictated our every move were all entangled in a vast and complex tapestry of power that defied simple morality. In weaving the threads of our daily struggles, they inadvertently highlighted a truth that I have come to cherish in my advanced age, that even in the midst of relentless despair, there blooms an enduring capacity for reflection, for finding poetry in the mundane, and for nurturing the seeds of hope in the fertile soil of shared human experience. The irony was not lost on me that those who seemed to live by the dictates of magic and might were themselves trapped in a game where the rules were as merciless as they were arbitrary. And so, in the quiet of a long, lonesome night, when the ghosts of a tortured past echoed softly in the recesses of my mind, I would allow myself a brief smile, an acknowledgement of the peculiar immortality of the spirit, even when all else had been reduced to ash and dust. The years have passed slowly, like the measured drumming of a weary heartbeat in a land that has long since forgotten both our names and our stories. Yet here I sit, determined to record these memories, in the hope that they may one day serve as a somnolent reminder of a time when life was harsh and full of sorrow, and yet also quietly filled with the resilient humor of those who refuse to let their spirits be completely vanquished. It is a history written in the language of pain and perseverance, a chronicle of forced labor that, despite the cruelty of its execution, ultimately bore witness to the enduring, albeit subdued, radiance of the orcish soul. As I continue to inscribe these recollections by the faint light of a dying candle, I am comforted by the thought that even in a world dominated by the iron rule of tyrants and the enigmatic interventions of whimsical wizards, there lived countless moments of defiant camaraderie, of quiet introspection, a testament to a life that despite all odds still knew how to dream, even if only in fleeting whispers. Now, as I near the end of this retelling for the present part of my chronicle, I cannot help but feel a gentle weariness that is both reflective and oddly calming. The days of forced labor, with their unyielding repetition and grim inevitability, have left marks deep within me. Marks that testify to a life fraught with unimaginable hardship, yet underscored by moments of subtle, shared humanity. I remind myself that each tedious day, each encounter with an exasperating warlord or an unnecessarily pompous wizard was not simply a brush with despair, but also an opportunity to learn something fundamental about the nature of our existence, that even under the oppressive weight of cruelty, there exists an unbreakable thread of hope that, against all odds, continues to weave the narrative of our lives. And so, as I offer these memories in the quiet, measured cadence of my final years, I do so with the conviction that our struggles, though tragic and relentless in their immediacy, have a purpose beyond mere suffering. They are the fabric of our past, the canvas upon which our smallest victories and most significant losses are painted, a tapestry of pain, resilience, and even a touch of droll humor that, in its own unassuming way, testifies to the indomitable spirit that refused to be completely swallowed by darkness. In this long reflection, I have attempted to lay bare the historical record of my days as an orc bound to forced labor, under the oppressive regimes of warlords, and disturbed by the episodic interventions of self-important wizards. I recount these memories not as a lament for what was lost, but as a quiet archive of human and orcish experience, one where even the bleakest moments were inextricably linked to a slow, enduring cadence of life that marched on regardless of the tyranny imposed upon us. I hope that in these words you may find a gentle solace, an affirmation that even the most unremarkable and arduous chapters of existence yield lessons in resilience and humor. In the soft pastel hues of recollection, my story, as monotonous as the sounds of labor in a cold stone cavern, as irksome as the preposterous wisdom of a meddling sorcerer, and as stark as the orders shouted by a warlord, remains a testament to the complexity of life itself. For in every measured step taken amidst despair, in every reluctant smile exchanged in the fleeting moments of reprieve, there lies a whisper of hope that defies the brutal certainty of fate. And now, as you listen to these words in the quiet of your own evening, allow your mind to wander over the slow, winding passages of a history marked not only by relentless hardships, but also by the undeniable spark of life that persists against all reason. Recall that every detail, however mundane, every forced labor day steeped in sorrow, and every absurd encounter with a wizard or tyrannical warlord contributed to a broader narrative, a chronicle of survival and a quiet defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. In the measured cadence of my recollections, there is a gentle humor that glimmers like a distant star, a humor that acknowledges that even in the darkest of stories, there remains a note of absurdity, a pause where the heart might briefly and almost imperceptibly smile. May these memories, recounted with deliberate languor and care, lull you into a state of reflective repose, as they have done for me throughout the long, winding passage of time. In the end, I remain an orc, not a creature of legend or myth, but a simple being who toiled beneath the oppressive skies, who endured the harsh commands of warlords and the baffling interludes of enchanters. My story, like the countless others of my kin, is one of unyielding endurance and quiet, relentless hope. I share it with you, not in a flourish of epic triumphs, but as a measured, soothing narrative drawn from the bittersweet archives of memory. It is a story that rests on the convergence of hardship and humor, of endless labor and fleeting moments of camaraderie, a testament to the idea that within every chain that binds, there may yet exist the seed of a strange, resilient freedom. As you drift off from these words, remember that even in the somnolent rhythms of a life defined by cruelty and absurdity, there is a gentle beat, one that endures long after the clamor of tyranny fades into the soft murmur of recollection. In that persistent cadence, there lies the quiet assurance that no matter how dark the days, the spark of our inner light continues to shimmer, a testimony to the resilience of a spirit that once found beauty in even the most unyielding circumstances. And so, with each measured recollection, I invite you to rest and dream of a time when the relentless weight of forced labor and the bluster of unappreciative masters could be met with not only sorrow, but with the enduring, if understated, warmth of shared memory. I suppose I should begin by saying that my life as an orc in those long-ago days was a tapestry woven from relentless labor, quiet rebellions of the spirit, and the absurd, yet inescapable presence of wizards and warlords alike. I remember the chill of early mornings, when the dim light scarcely broke the horizon, and I found myself dragged from a meager rest on the cold stone of our subterranean dwellings. It was during those hours, when even the echoes seemed subdued by the weight of our burdens, that I first began to appreciate the unexpected coetry of forced labor. The routine was as unyielding as the basalt walls around us. We marched to the great quarries and mines, our limbs heavy with weariness, yet our hearts quietly rebellious in the small, secret corners of our minds. Each shovelful of rock and every weary step etched a minute detail into my memory, a detail that I now recount in the sober, even soothing way of an old historian sharing one of his bedtime tales. I was not alone in these endeavors, of course, for our band of orcs shared in the common plight. Together, we bore the load of our master's cruel orders, a duty enforced by the towering figures of warlords who cared little for the comfort of their underlings. I recall one interminable afternoon, when the smoldering heat made the rocks appear as if they were melting into a shapeless gray mass. There, amidst the group, an ancient warlord with a scar that traversed his face like a winding river barked orders and threats with such disdainful precision that even the labor itself seemed to pause, as if uncertain whether to continue or to shrink back in deference. His voice, rough as gravel, yet oddly musical in its cadence, resonated through our group, marking the very air with an inevitability that only dull fate could muster. And yet some time later, as I sat quietly polishing a rough edge of a stone by chance, I could not help but smile at the irony of it all. In a world where every moment was ruled by the endless demands of hard work and oppressive oversight, even a warlord's roguish sneer could serve as an inadvertent reminder of the absurdity of our existence. Even more perplexing, though, were the wizards, who often intruded upon our routines. These tall, incongruously robed beings had a habit of appearing at the most inconvenient moments, as if they believed that their pointed hats and ancient tones granted them the privilege to disrupt our labor without a second thought. I remember one particularly tiresome day when, amid our grueling task of hauling a cart laden with heavy ore, a wizard named Belmarine, a name he himself announced with an air of self-importance, strolled onto the site with his long, silvery beard trailing behind him like a comet's tail. He began lecturing us about the cosmic balance of energies and the mystical significance of our humble labors, all while casually overlooking the fact that the mere sound of his voice stirred an inexplicable restlessness even within the unyielding hearts of orcs. His words, cluttered with arcane jargon and sprinkled with references to ancient prophecies, filled the space as much as the sound of clashing metal. I recall that I listened with a sort of morbid curiosity, attempting to memorize the peculiar cadence of his language, a cadence that at times felt as misplaced as the wizard himself among so many toiling orcs. Over time, I began noting the small, almost comical idiosyncrasies that accompanied our existence as forced laborers under such tyrannical overseers. There was the peculiar way in which the dust in the mines would settle in precise, almost artistic patterns on our cracked leather tunics, patterns that when viewed with a touch of imaginative nostalgia resembled miniature maps of lands we might never see. I sometimes fancied that those speckled patterns were secret messages from the earth itself, messages that only an orc with a long enough memory and a keen enough eye could decipher. At evening's respite, gathered around the sparse warmth of a meager fire, my companions and I would share our own theories about these natural runes, theories that were as fleeting as they were humorous. It was in these small moments of pensive camaraderie that I discovered solace, a secret realm where the hardships and humiliations of the day were transformed into a quiet rebellion of spirit, a soft rebellion against the inevitability of our burdens. In those same evenings, conversations often strayed towards the peculiar ways in which our oppressors managed their own affairs. I distinctly recall a time when a particularly irritable warlord, whose temper was as legendary as the jagged scars on his body, insisted that we rearrange a set of stones into what he called a strategic formation. The task, absurd in its simplicity, was imposed with the gravity of a divine command. As we heaved stone after stone, the labor more sedate than our usual tasks, I couldn't help but note the irony of men who believed that even nature might be manipulated to serve their ambitions. Perhaps, in hindsight, the warlord's folly was a reflection of a deeper truth. Those who impose order on a chaotic world often find themselves tangled in their own contrivances. I remember how we orcs exchanged glances filled with quiet, ironic amusement at the spectacle of such disordered order, an amusement as soft and fleeting as the dying embers of our fire. Days melted into weeks, and then into what felt like endless seasons of labor and subjugation. In my quieter moments, while the ceaseless rhythm of forced labor lulled me into a contemplative reverie, I began to imagine a different world, one where the weight of forced labor might be less crushing, where the demands of warlords and wizards were softened by a gentler hand. I would imagine strolling through a landscape untarnished by the clang of stone and metal, a place where the songs of nature, rather than the harsh commands of authority, were the soundtrack to my days. In these moments, I allowed myself to indulge in trivial fantasies, such as a world where the orcs could enjoy leisure without fear of reprisal, a world where our collective quirks, our unspoken love for patterns in dust, and our secret cataloging of every incongruity in our master's orders were celebrated rather than suppressed. One particularly memorable afternoon comes to mind. The sky had taken on a soft, muted hue, as if it were hiding its usual brilliance behind a curtain of reluctant cloud. We had been assigned a task that, while physically demanding, seemed designed for some cosmic jest, digging trenches along a ridge that offered little in the way of shelter from the oppressive sun. As we worked, the heat rose languidly off the ground, and even the rocks seemed to sweat under the relentless gaze of the day. It was during these moments that the ever-watchful wizard, Belmarin, reappeared. His arrival was as dramatic as it was untimely. He spun in a wide arc, nearly colliding with one of our carts, his robes flaring as if he were performing some elaborate ritual. He began to pontificate about the virtues of perseverance and the sacredness of manual labor. I must confess that watching him, I found a certain muted humor in his pretensions. Here was a man who had spent countless years beset by his own fabricated gravitas, now choosing to lecture on something as ordinary as digging trenches, as if the act itself held the secret to all of existence. I took a slow breath, letting the absurdity of it all wash over me, and in that quiet moment, the relentless burden of forced labor seemed to recede just slightly, in the face of the sheer, unintentional comedy of our situation. In the interstices of these long days, where every minute was measured by the weight of effort and every hour by the monotony of repetition, I found that it was often the minutiae, the way the silvery dust would sometimes form a nearly perfect circle around my boot, or the unexpected cadence of a fellow Orc's grumbled exclamation, that offered the greatest solace. There was a peculiar sort of beauty in these insignificant details, as if the universe, in all its grandeur, was sneaking small, whimsical gifts into the laps of those caught in its relentless current. I would sometimes trace the patterns in the dust with my calloused fingers, marveling at the way a single speck could transform an ordinary moment into a fleeting work of art. And as I did so, I would quietly reflect that perhaps our forced labor was not entirely without reward. After all, in the midst of hardship, it is often the overlooked details, the gentle arc of a rock, the soft murmur of a distant stream, the brief, shared smile between comrades that speak most truly of life's subtle grace. I must also note how the warlords, those grim figures who ruled with an iron fist and a penchant for grandiose declarations, contributed to the surreal tapestry of my daily existence. One such warlord, whose name my tongue still recalls with a mixture of bitterness and reluctant amusement, Gorthak, I believe it was, had the peculiar habit of pausing his tirades to adjust his rather ostentatious cape. It seemed to me that he placed as much care into the arrangement of his attire as he did into dictating the specifics of our labor. I observed him on several occasions, poised dramatically against the backdrop of a blood-red sunset. As if he were an actor on the stage of a never-ending epic, his words, though laden with the weight of oppressive command, were inevitably interrupted by the necessity to ensure that his cape flowed correctly in the breeze. In these instances, my thoughts wandered to the notion that perhaps there was a hidden lesson in all of it, a reminder that even the most menacing figures had their moments of vanity and care that rendered them, in some odd way, human. This realization did little to ease my burdens, but it did allow me to view the tyranny with a weary, almost affectionate resignation. After all, if even the mightiest among our oppressors could be foiled by the trivialities of wardrobe adjustments, then maybe, just maybe, there was a small crack in the armor of our otherwise relentless plight. The days gave way to weeks, and over time I began to discern patterns in the seeming randomness of our ordeals. There were days when the labor felt almost bearable, not because the work itself was transformed into something pleasing, but because our collective spirit found ways to weave humor and reflection into the fabric of our reality. During one such period, a time when even the sun seemed reluctant to impose its full brilliance, I spent long, languid hours meticulously rearranging the shards of broken stone into what I later fancied called ephemeral sculptures. These modest creations, born of idle moments amidst ceaseless labor, were my silent protest against the crushing inevitability of our circumstances. I would set aside a few stray stones here and there, aligning them with the precision of one who sought a momentary respite from the grind. In doing so, I discovered that there was a kind of meditative peace in the act of creation, however transient it might be. And so, by day's end, as I gazed upon these small arrangements with a mixture of pride and wistful melancholy, I felt as though I had reclaimed a small piece of my autonomy. It was a reminder that even in the heart of hardship, the capacity for beauty and meaning could be, if only for a fleeting instant, resurrected from the fragments of our daily toils. There were, of course, imperfections and setbacks even in these rebellious diversions. Inevitably, a wayward cart or an errant stone would undo the care I put into my sculpture, eliciting from my comrades a series of sympathetic sighs and half-hearted chuckles. I recall one particularly memorable incident when a sudden tremor, mysterious in its origin, yet perhaps a subtle reminder from the earth itself, sent a cascade of fragments tumbling into disarray. I stood there, watching the carefully constructed pattern disintegrate into a chaotic jumble, and couldn't help but laugh softly at the absurdity of it all. That laughter, deep and resonant in its quiet humor, was not so much an expression of joy as it was an acknowledgement of life's inescapable caprice. In these moments, I felt a kinship with the orcs around me. Despite our shared suffering, we found in each other the faint, enduring spark of resilience, a spark that could transform the most wearisome day into one marked by the unexpected poetry of impermanence. Not all days were filled with such subtle joys, however. Many afternoons were dominated by the relentless oversight of our masters, whose disdain for our frailty was matched only by their meticulous attention to our failures. I remember all too well the long hours spent rebuilding collapsed scaffolds after a particularly severe bout of exhaustion had left us vulnerable. In these moments of raw, unadorned hardship, it seemed 500 milliseconds, as though even the elements conspired against us. The sky would darken inexplicably, and the wind would howl as if mourning the loss of yet another day of fruitless labor. It was during one such stormy interlude that I found myself huddled among my fellows, our bodies battered and our spirits quietly fraying at the edges. As I gazed over the tumult of swirling dust and rain, I realized that our struggle was not one of isolated misery, but a shared journey, a collective wading through the mire of a fate that had been cast in stone long before our time. And as the storm subsided, leaving behind a landscape both ravaged and strangely cleansed, I felt a quiet kinship with every living thing that had endured that day's cruelty. Even the stones, dark and silent though they were, seemed to whisper in a language older than any warlord's command, a language that spoke of persistence and an indomitable will to persist quietly, almost in spite of itself. The intrusion of wizards, while often a source of exasperation, also provided moments of unexpected insight. Belmarin, in his many visits, sometimes let slip hints of a broader cosmic narrative, a universe in which even our suffering was but one thread in the vast loom of destiny. I recall a day when, after enduring an especially arbitrary lecture on the inherent spiritual value of our endurance, Belmarin paused and with a tone of surprising candor remarked how even the smallest act of defiance could ripple through the currents of fate. His words, delivered with the soft timbre of a man who had seen more than most, struck a chord deep within me. I began to wonder if there were subtler ways to resist the oppressive mandates imposed upon us. Perhaps, I mused, our quiet acts of artistic rearrangement, or even the gentle mockery of an overdramatic warlord, were not truly futile, but rather the seeds of a slow and almost imperceptible revolution. Of course, such thoughts were as dangerous as they were comforting, for the power that be rarely took kindly to any hint that the natural order might be challenged, even in the form of a soft, almost imperceptible chuckle at the expense of authority. I carried with me the memory of these exchanges as I trudged through countless days marked by unending toil. There were times when I would find myself so utterly absorbed in the methodical rhythm of our daily labor that the world beyond our immediate struggles seemed to vanish altogether. In those rare moments, the repetitive heft of each stone, the worn cadence of our collective footsteps, and even the near-mythical presence of our pompous overseers merged into an almost meditative state. It was as if our forced labor, with all its burdens and indignities, had unwittingly become a kind of prayer, a quiet hymn to survival in a landscape where mercy was a luxury beyond our reach. And though such meditations were often interrupted by the clamor of duty or a particularly irksome lecture from a wayward wizard, they remained as fleeting refrains that sustained me through the longer, darker nights. Nightfall itself, with its gentle descent and the soft obscurity it cast upon the world became a cherished reprieve from the ceaseless demands of the day. Beneath a sky fretted with stars that blinked like tired memories, we orcs gathered quietly in our small circle, our brief conversations drifting on the cool air like whispered secrets. I would sometimes speak of dreams that had visited me. A dream, for instance, in which I wandered through a forest where the trees hummed softly and every rock and leaf held a story of its own. These dreams, vivid in their ordinariness, were reminders that life could be savored even in the smallest of details. The gentle rustle of the wind through sparse brush, the delicate play of shadows on rough stone, and the almost inaudible murmur of distant waters all spoke to a hidden beauty that, if one paid close enough attention, could uplift even a heart burdened by relentless labor. I recall one particular night when a subtle, almost imperceptible mist began to rise from the earth. It was an ordinary occurrence, yet in the hushed silence of our nocturnal gathering, it seemed imbued with an almost mystical significance. As the vapors swirled quietly about our feet, I imagined that they carried with them the hushed voices of countless orcs from generations past, a soft, collective sigh that resonated with the wisdom of endurance. In that quiet communion of souls, the boundaries between our individual sufferings seemed to blur. We were, for that fleeting moment, a single unified entity, bound together by the shared burdens of our existence and the quiet hope that somewhere, somehow, our struggles might one day be transformed into something lighter, something with a trace of joy beneath its weight. It was during these silent vigils that I would sometimes catch myself reflecting on the paradoxes of our fated lot. One of the most enduring paradoxes was how the very instruments of our subjugation, the tools, the stones, and the rigid structures built by our warlords, could, in their indifferent constancy, provide a canvas upon which our subdued creativity found expression. I began to see in every chiseled groove and every well-worn pathway the potential for transformation, no matter how minute or transient. It occurred to me that perhaps our forced labor was not entirely devoid of meaning. Instead, it was, in its own unassuming manner, a narrative of resistance, a daily testimony that even in the heart of oppression, the human or orcish spirit could find small ways to rebel against the tide of despair. In the delicate interplay between enforced order and natural chaos, I discerned the soft, persistent murmur of hope, a hope that was as fragile as a dew-laden cobweb, yet as enduring as the stubborn roots of an ancient tree clinging to life in a barren rock face. There were times, too, when the interactions with our masters took on the semblance of farcical theater. I remember, with a blend of nostalgia and resigned amusement, an incident involving another of our itinerant wizards, one whose name escapes me now, but who was distinguished by an overly elaborate flourish of his wand and a tendency to misplace his spectacles at the worst possible moments. I had been tasked with carrying a particularly cumbersome load of dark, polished stone across a stretch of uneven ground when this wizard, exceedingly pompous in manner, appeared and began to critique my very technique of labor. He insisted, with all the misplaced confidence of someone who had clearly read far too many dusty tomes, that I should align my movements with the cosmic cadence of the earth. I could not help but let a quiet chuckle escape me at the absurdity of his demand. There I was, an orc shaped by the impersonal brutality of forced labor, being admonished for not synchronizing my gait with some mystical rhythm known only to a handful of self-important sorcerers. Even as I complied with his demands, carefully, as if to ease his fragile vanity, I fondly recalled that moment for the unexpected levity it brought into an otherwise unyielding day. As the years passed, in that unvarying cycle of labor, supervision, and intermittent moments of droll humor, I learned to find endurance in the continuity of the mundane. Each day, with its predictable array of hardships, wove itself into a long, unbroken chain of memory, a chain that, when viewed from the distant vantage point of time, revealed hidden patterns and small victories. I discovered that the slow passage of the days allowed me, in my quieter moments, to piece together a narrative of existence that was as rich in detail as it was heavy with sorrow. And so I began to record these minutiae, composing a quiet chronicle of our daily lives, a chronicle that, while it might never inspire epic ballads or grand legends, possessed a subtle truth all its own. It was a truth found not in explosive deeds of rebellion or in the magnificent triumph of the spirit, but in the small, unadorned acts of defiance that filled the spaces between relentless tasks. A smile exchanged with a fellow laborer, a whispered joke about a warlord's vanity, the careful rearrangement of stones that, for a fleeting moment, defied the harsh mandates imposed upon us. There were times I would catch myself, in a rare moment of solitude, pondering the curious nature of our existence. It struck me that there was a certain solemn dignity in persevering through the ceaseless trials of forced labor. A dignity that belonged not to the mighty warlords who boasted of their conquests, but to those of us who, day after interminable day, carried on without complaint. Even as the rough cadence of our lives was punctuated by the arbitrary whims of those in power, I recognized that beneath the surface of oppression, there lay a quiet, unshakable resilience, a subtle, steadfast pulse of life that refused to be dimmed by the weight of tyranny. This inner strength, I came to understand, was nourished by the most unexpected of things, a well-placed ray of sunlight that filtered through a narrow crevice in the stone, the gentle murmur of a kind word shared in passing, or the simple recognition that in our collective suffering there existed an unspoken solidarity. It was this solidarity that made our labor bearable, if only marginally so, and that lent us the strength to endure the ceaseless parade of oppressive decrees and whimsical intrusions. As seasons turned and the once familiar patterns of our daily toils began to blur with the passage of time, I found myself increasingly preoccupied with thoughts of chronicling not only the hardships, but also the quiet, almost imperceptible moments of beauty that we had managed to carve out of our grim existence. In my solitude, I started to see my life as a series of interconnected vignettes, a slow, deliberate cadence of days blending into one another, each one marked by the steady rhythm of forced labor and punctuated by the occasional burst of laughter or shared melancholy. I would often sit near the edge of the worksite, tracing my calloused fingers over the rough surface of a stone, and let my mind wander through the corridors of memory. In such moments, I observed how even the most trivial detail, a stray pebble here, a forgotten crease in a torn piece of fabric there, could, when taken in its proper context, reveal a story of heartbreak, resilience, or even unexpected humor. And so I began to compile these observations, like a quiet historian, gathering fragments of a once fragmented truth, intent on preserving the subtle legacy of our existence for some distant time, when perhaps the meaning of our struggles might be understood in a different light. In those reflective moments, the presence of the wizards and warlords, so dominant in our daily lives, seemed increasingly like a curious footnote in the grand narrative of our collective experience. Their grand speeches, their absurd demands, and their relentless need to dictate every minor detail of our existence gradually assumed the quality of distant echoes, a reminder, perhaps, that in the unfolding tapestry of life, even the loudest voices might one day fade into gentle whispers. There was a peculiar comfort in that realization, a tacit understanding that the tyranny of any single day, no matter how severe, was ultimately subsumed by the slow, deliberate march of time. Over time, I came to view each laborious moment as a small act of quiet rebellion, a rebellion not against the overt authority of warlords or the verbose intrusions of wizards, but against the creeping despair that sought to claim our souls. In that light, every drop of sweat, Every aching muscle, every silent sigh in the darkness became a testament to the resilience of a people who, even in the heart of oppression, nurtured a secret hope for a kinder and more merciful world. I must confess that there were moments when I envied the very nature of our oppressors. The warlords, with all their bluster, seemed to revel in the luxury of not having to worry about the minutiae that burdened us. Their lives, in all their grandiosity and pomp, were a series of dramatic declarations and elaborate pageantry, a life far removed from the humble, measured pace of our own existence. And the wizards, with their sprawling, arcane philosophies and their constant meddling in the affairs of the mundane, lived in a realm of ideas that seemed as light and airy as the mists that sometimes graced our work sites at dawn. Yet, in reflecting on their seemingly easier plight, I realized that with all the extravagance of their existence came its own set of burdens. The burden of expectation, the ever-pressing need to maintain an aura of superiority, and the silent, gnawing anxiety that perhaps beneath their scholarly veneer lay hidden vulnerabilities. In those rare moments of introspection, I found that our burdens, as relentless as they were, had at least fostered in us a kind of honest, if unassuming, humanity. There was no pretense in our struggle, only the raw, unadorned truth of life as it was, in all its immeasurable difficulty and surprising tenderness. And so, as I now recount these recollections by the gentle glow of memory, I am reminded that even in a life dictated by forced labor, tyranny, and the incessant interruptions of self-important wizards, there can be found a quiet, enduring romance, a romance between suffering and resilience, between the drudgery of each day and the flickering promise of something gentler at the horizon. I sometimes wonder if, in another life or another age, the humble story of an orc laborer might be recast into a grand epic of defiance and liberation. Yet here I remain, content to dwell in the modest realm of truth, where even the most wretched of circumstances can give rise to moments of quiet beauty and even subtle humor. It is a truth that decades on continues to guide my thoughts like the soft, steady pulse of a long-remembered lullaby. I remember one such twilight, when the waning light played upon the granite surfaces of our labor site, casting gentle shadows that danced alongside our weary steps. In that fragile moment, as if the world itself had taken a slow, measured breath, I found solace in the rhythm of our relentless toil, a rhythm that had come, over time, to resemble the ticking of some timeless metronome. There was a certain serenity in that cadence, a reminder that even the harshest forces of nature and authority were ultimately subject to the unyielding passage of time. As I set my weathered hand against the rough surface of an ancient boulder, I could almost feel its silent testimony, that each stone in our path, each cruel command, and every whispered joke among comrades was part of a grand and intricate mosaic. The realization was profoundly simple, but no less stirring, and it filled me with a quiet pride, an inner warmth that stood in stark contrast to the biting chill of our daily hardships. In this measured recounting of my life, I find that the minutiae, the slow, deliberate act of placing one stone beside another, the hushed camaraderie shared beneath a sky streaked with the fading hues of dusk, the subtle, almost imperceptible gestures of defiance, such as a knowing glance exchanged between a tired laborer and a friend, compose the true narrative of our existence. It is a narrative that insists on reminding us that even in the face of immense adversity, there are small pockets of light, however fleeting, that illuminate the path forward. Much like the soft glow of a single lantern in an otherwise impenetrable darkness, these moments of gentle humor and quiet reflection offered a gentle reprieve from the unending demands of forced labor and the incessant intrusions by those self-important wizards. Now, as I sit and reflect on these memories, in the soft twilight of my later years, I feel a profound sense of gratitude for the strange and intricate journey that has defined my life. I have come to understand that our experience, marked as it was by hardship and managed by forces far greater than ourselves, was also a canvas upon which we orcs painted our subtle acts of endurance. Every back-breaking day, every nonsensical command from an imperious warlord, and every absurd interruption by a wand-wielding lecturer contributed to a symphony of the everyday, a symphony that, despite its discordant notes, held within it the tender strains of hope. And so, when I close my eyes in the quiet moments of dusk, I do not think of my life as one defined solely by misery, but rather as a carefully wrought tapestry in which every dull, unremarkable detail held a hidden glimmer of meaning. There were other days, too, when the weight of fate seemed particularly unbearable. A day when the task was so exhausting that not even the artificial cheerfulness of our masters could stir the faintest light of relief within us. I recall, with surprising clarity, the moment when a sudden and inexplicable bout of laughter broke out among my comrades. It began as a mere twitch at the corner of a face, a subtle upward curvature of a lip in the midst of grueling labor. Before long, a low, cooperative chuckle spread among us, transcending the boundaries of language and circumstance. In that fleeting instant, our shared misery momentarily dissolved into something more tender, a brief, fragile connection that made the burden of our plight seem, if only for a heartbeat, less insurmountable. It is a memory I cherish, for it reminded me that even in the heart of unyielding oppression, the human, or orcish, spirit could not help but find a reason to laugh at the absurdities of its own destiny. I must also say that one cannot overlook the curious twists of fortune that occasionally punctuated our interminable days. There was an instance when, after a particularly grueling stretch of labor, an unexpected rain began to fall, a soft and persistent drizzle that washed over us like a quiet benediction. The rain, a gentle patter on the battered surfaces of our world, seemed to momentarily suspend the harsh dictates of our masters and the chaotic presence of those meddlesome wizards. In that transient pause, as the droplets mingled with the dust on our skin, I felt as though time itself had eased its relentless pace. I remember standing there with the rain, feeling it seep into my very bones, and marveling at how such a small, ordinary occurrence could carry with it the promise of renewal. For a brief moment, the arduous labor, the endless orders, and the pompous declarations of authority all receded into the background, leaving behind a quiet space filled with the gentle sighs of nature. It was one of those rare instants where the world, in all its complexity and cruelty, seemed to remember that beauty could be found even in the simplest of things. In the soft years that followed those long, laborious days, I came to treasure the memory of every small kindness and every quiet act of endurance that had, in its own humble way, shaped my existence. My life as an orc, though burdened with the ceaseless demands of forced labor and the persistent absurdity of those who commanded me, was also a collection of moments that spoke quietly of resistance, of subtle rebellions against a predestined fate. I have collected these memories as one might gather delicate wildflowers on the edge of a forgotten path, each one, though small and unassuming on its own, contributing in time to a tapestry of existence that is rich in quiet beauty. So now, as I recount these experiences with a slow, reflective cadence that has become my constant companion in the later hours of the day, I find comfort in the knowledge that each day, no matter how filled with hardship, was an opportunity for something imperceptibly tender to emerge. The forced labor that once threatened to crush our spirits had, over time, become the very soil in which our resilience took root. Every order barked by a surly warlord, every nonsensical command of a self-important wizard, every humiliating task imposed on us, contributed, I remember. As I settle into the gentle cadence of recollection, the long days and even longer nights of my past, a life so different from the quiet moments I now savor. I was an orc, one of many, and not the fearsome, battle-crushing sort spoken of with fierce pride by my kin, but rather one forced into the labor of our overlords, a life measured in tasks and gloom that crept in slowly. Relentless drip of water in a dark, forgotten cave. In those days, my every step was heavy with the weight of expectation and the crushing burden of orders from warlords and wizards, whose demands were as unyielding as the stone they chiseled. I set aside memories of furious battles and boisterous conquests to dwell instead on the minutiae of my life, a series of quiet, sorrowful observations that, as I now recount them, sometimes provoke a weary smile, even if their memory is bitter. I was assigned to endless tasks in stone quarries on the outskirts of a murky, unyielding land that seemed to have forgotten the warmth of the sun. The stones, large and immovable, were to be chipped and hewn for the monuments of those who ruled with both cruelty and an irritating fondness for grandiose gestures. Each morning, before the faint blush of dawn had brushed the sky, I was roused by the harsh clamor of a horn, a sound so shrill and relentless that it seemed designed to banish any lingering thoughts of peaceful sleep. My comrades and I shuffled to our stations, a line of dark figures against a pale sky, our hearts heavy with resignation, even as our limbs stirred into action. I recall, in the midst of the never-ending labor, one particular day when an annoyingly officious wizard arrived on the scene. His robes shimmered with an ostentatious flair, and his staff, carved with runes that he insisted held enormous magical power, tapped impatiently on the ground. He walked among us, his eyes rolling so conspicuously that one could almost imagine he thought our struggles as mundane as the rustling of dried leaves. He muttered incantations and offered pointless advice on the proper technique for lifting a hammer and striking a chisel, as if a sorcerer were an authority on the delicate art of labor. I could not help but think that his endless prattle was as exhausting as the work itself. And in my quieter moments, I found it amusing in a melancholy sort of way that even the magical were not immune to the tedium of bureaucracy. The labor was unending. Days blurred together into a continuous march of compulsory exertion, punctuated only by brief, unsatisfying rests in the cold gloom of our makeshift camps. We lived in an austere rhythm. Our meals were meager, coarse bread and water that tasted faintly of the stony earth we labored upon, and our conversations, when we dared to indulge in a whisper of humor at what we deemed the absurdity of our situation, were filled with wry observations on the idiosyncrasies of our captors. I remember in particular a conversation about the ever-changing moods of our warlord, a man whose unpredictable tirades could reduce a work zone to a chaotic uproar in mere moments. His temper was legendary, and yet his demands were laced with a sort of calculated cruelty that left little room for error. It was as if every day was constructed to remind us that our very existence was only tolerated as long as we served his insatiable hunger for power and prestige. There were moments, amid the ceaseless drudgery, when I glimpsed small shards of humor nestled in the cracks of our daily routine. On one occasion, as we were hewing stones in near total silence, a fallen piece of rock had rounded off so perfectly that it vaguely resembled the mustached visage of one of the higher generals. A few soft chuckles passed between us, a brief but luminous spark of shared sardonic insight that momentarily lightened our heavy hearts. The sight reminded me that even in the darkest of places, a bit of absurdity could shine through, like a lone star flickering in a sky blanketed by oppressive clouds. My recollections drift further back to the early days of my enslavement, a time when hope was as scarce as the shards of sunlight that managed to pierce the gloom. I was but a young orc then, untested by the harsher realities of the world, and naive enough to entertain dreams of valor and glory. I had heard tales of honor and heroism passed down in whispered legends, but nothing in those legends had prepared me for the crushing reality of forced labor. The transition from a life filled with the rambunctious splendor of orcish mischief to one defined by tireless, oppressive work was as jarring as it was inevitable. I gradually learned that my days would be spent in ceaseless toil, my talents put to subservient use in a vast, indifferent machinery that cared little for the aspirations of its parts. Our quarters were little more than cramped hovels, hidden in the folds of a barren wilderness. The simplicity of our shelter was marked by splintered wood and uneven stone floors, and even as the bitter cold of night seeped into our bones, we had little recourse for comfort. There was a certain poetic desolation in the way nature itself seemed to recoil before the oppressive architecture of our labor camps, a wilderness of gnarled trees and brackish streams that offered no solace. It was in this world, under the rule of imperious warlords and meddlesome wizards, that I came to understand the true weight of resignation. I learned that endurance was not born solely of strength, but also of the deep, unspoken resolve to find meaning in each long, aching day. I spent many nights gazing at the sky, wishing for the tranquility of stars. On those clear evenings, far removed from the rough clamor of our compound, I would escape into my private reveries, recalling the laughter and lightness of a simpler past. I recalled days when the forest was my playground, and the river, with its gentle murmur, a hymn to the ease of existing. The transition to a life of relentless labor was marked not by a loss of joy, as one might expect, but rather by a slow, almost imperceptible shift, a gentle erosion of hope, akin to the gradual wearing away of stone by persistent water. Even as I toiled beneath the stern gaze of our masters, the memory of those halcyon days sparked a quiet defiance within me, one that found expression in the small acts of camaraderie amongst my fellow orcs. One of my closest companions in those dark times was an orc named Bronak, a creature of considerable stature and a surprisingly gentle disposition. Bronak was not one to seek attention or to challenge the edicts of our captors openly, yet in his gaze one could detect a wistful longing for a life not entirely defined by suffering. In the rare moments when we were permitted a brief reprieve, a shared morsel of food, or a softly spoken word, the two of us would exchange musings on the absurdity of our condition. He had an uncanny ability to find humor in our suppression, remarking often that if one must be forced to labor, at least one might as well do so with a measure of dignity and a twinkle of mischief in the eye. His dry wit left me chuckling softly, even as the hardships of daily life weighed upon me like a shroud. In the heat of the day, our overseers, grim-faced and unyielding figures, would stride past us, their eyes filled with a mixture of disdain and barely concealed irritation at our slow, deliberate movements. One particularly memorable overseer was a man whose name I never learned, for he found little value in such formalities. His methods were direct and his punishments swift, for he believed that strict discipline was the only language that the enslaved could understand. But even within the rigid confines of his discipline, I occasionally noted the absurdity of his own existence, a man so devoted to enforcing order that his very presence seemed to mock the chaotic tumult of his superior's grand designs. At times, I wondered if his stern exterior was merely a mask to hide the same impotent despair that we all felt in our hearts. The days merged one into another, a series of repetitive motions that left little room for individual thought. I would awaken to the sound of the horn, my mind numbed by the recurrent cycle of labor, and trudge to the quarry with a heavy heart. Each swing of the hammer was accompanied by the silent counting of the minutes until dusk, when the labor would cease, only to be resumed again at the break of dawn. The relentless passage of time became my closest, if most unwelcome, companion. Yet even in those moments of unbroken monotony, I found the odd detail, an oddly shaped pebble, a pattern in the way the dust swirled in the air, that reminded me of the intricate tapestry of life. These small fragments of beauty, as ephemeral as they were fleeting, served as gentle counterpoints to the harsh cadence of our existence. I recall a certain afternoon when the sky threatened rain and the chill of impending weather seemed to seep into the very marrow of our bones. The work proceeded, as always, methodical and measured, with not even the warning of a gathering storm providing us a moment's respite from our labors. It was then that the aforementioned wizard reappeared, his presence marked by an air of self-importance that made the grumblings of the men around him all the more bitter. He spoke in low, almost conspiratorial tones, lecturing us on the balance of energies and the importance of aligning our labors with the cosmic forces at play. I listened, partly out of habit, and partly from the genuine curiosity that occasionally pierced the veil of our somnolent existence. But I could not help feeling that his mystic babble was a cruel jest, a reminder of the chasm between our unenlightened toil and the lofty ambitions of our overlords. This wizard, whose incessant chatter often intruded upon our scarce moments of quiet, appeared to relish in the opportunity to pontificate on matters far beyond the realm of our immediate concerns. His words dripped with an air of superiority, as though he were the sole custodian of wisdom in a world that seemed, through our weary eyes, riddled with meaninglessness. And yet, as absurd as it may sound, there were times when his peculiar observations evoked a fleeting smile on my otherwise sullen face, a smile of recognition that perhaps we were all, in our own small ways, participants in a farcical play orchestrated by fate. I would remember his ramblings during my darkest hours, and find in them a curious sort of comfort, as if his nonsensical lectures were a counterpoint to the bleak certainty of our predicament. I grew accustomed to the presence of these grand figures, the warlords, whose decrees dictated our every move. The wizards whose mysticism provided a veneer of enigmatic authority over our lives, and in time, their eccentricities became part of the backdrop of my existence. To an onlooker in another time or place, perhaps it might seem as though I was complicit in this system of forced labor, that I had surrendered to a fate dictated by powers far beyond my control. Yet, in the quiet recesses of my heart, there remained a stubborn ember of thought that insisted on the beauty of brief, unguarded moments of normalcy. A memory, for instance, of a rare day when the dust settled just enough to reveal the delicate veins of a stone, or of a night when the wind whispered tales of distant lands once known for laughter and light. The labor was not without its small rewards. There were times when the work allowed a brief interval of reflection under a sky so vast and untroubled that, for a moment, I almost believed that freedom lay just beyond the horizon. I would set aside a few rough-edged stones that bore the marks of nature's quiet artistry, and ponder the possibility that even in a realm defined by forced labor and oppressive rule, there could be a sliver of something resembling hope. In these moments, I felt almost human again, as if the simple act of pausing to appreciate a stray shard of beauty imbued me with the power to dream, even if just for a fleeting second. Yet the push and pull of despair and defiance was a familiar dance. As dusk fell and our labor came to an end, with the same inevitability as the passing of the day, we gathered around grim fires that did little to thaw the cold that crept into our bones. It was during these quiet evenings that our discussions turned inward, toward memories of simpler times and dreams of a future that seemed as distant as the stars above. I listened to the murmurs of my comrades, each voice laced with the intricate mixture of sorrow, resignation, and the odd spark of rebellion that refused to be entirely snuffed out. In these shared moments, the heavy burden of our fate was momentarily lifted, replaced by a fragile camaraderie forged in the crucible of our common suffering. I remember one such night in particular, when the bitter wind rattled the walls of our meager shelters, and rain began to patter softly against the canvas of our temporary abodes. We huddled together, not in celebration of our misery, but as a small act of solidarity against the unyielding forces that sought to dwarf our individuality. Bronach, with his deep rumbling voice, recounted an absurd story of how one clever orc had once managed to outsmart an overbearing sorcerer by hiding behind a cleverly disguised boulder. His tale, while clearly embellished for effect, allowed us a gentle reprieve from the relentless harshness of our surroundings. I found myself chuckling softly, marveling at the resilience of the spirit, even in the most downtrodden corners of our existence. Our existence was dictated by a calendar of torment and drudgery that left little room for personal flourish. Over time, days bled together into an endless cycle, a rhythm of waking at the call of the horn, working until fatigue threatened to overwhelm even the most stubborn of bodies, and returning to our modest quarters with a silence that was heavy with unspoken grief. Yet even as I endured these conditions, I began to realize that the true measure of our lives was not solely the cruelty imposed upon us, but also the subtle, often overlooked moments of shared humanity. In the furtive smiles exchanged during the rare instance of a light-hearted remark, or in the quiet nod of acknowledgement when a particularly clever observation was made, we found a spark of solace in one another. These moments, brief as they were a testament to the resilience of our spirit, proof that even in the face of relentless oppression, the heart could find a way to hold on to its fragile sense of self. In the slow, measured passing of days and nights, I came to understand that our suffering was interwoven with the mundane details that defined our existence. The daily act of gathering water from a murky well, the repetitive motions required to position a heavy stone just so, and the quiet observance of a single leaf caught on a stray breath of wind. All these minutiae contributed to a tapestry of experience that, when viewed in its entirety, told a story of perseverance amid adversity. Even the oft-repeated announcements from our distant warlords carried within them a faint glimmer of irony. Their grand pronouncements, delivered with all the pomp one might expect from a commander of armies, were rendered almost laughable by the reality of our condition. They spoke of honor and destiny, as if we were active participants in an epic saga. Yet I knew that our roles were confined to that of reluctant cogs in a relentless machine. As time continued its inexorable march, I observed subtle shifts within myself. The harshness of our circumstances had dimmed into a quiet resignation, a state of being where the mind grew capable of finding a sort of solace in even the most tedious of tasks. I found that I could spend hours lost in contemplation, watching the interplay of light and shadow on the rough-hewn walls of the quarry, or listening to the cadence of my own heartbeat as a meditative counterpoint to the clamor of the day. In these moments, the burden of forced labor seemed, if only briefly, to recede into the background, replaced by the dawning realization that even amid oppression, there was a kind of poetry that could be found in the minutest details of existence. It was near the end of one particularly grueling season, a season marked by an unseasonable chill and an unyielding gray sky, that I experienced an encounter with a warlord whose presence was as undeniable as it was infuriating. He was a man of few words, his authority emanating from a mere glance that seemed capable of freezing the marrow in one's bones. In the midst of a particularly strenuous task, as I labored beneath the glare of a sullen sun, I caught sight of this man, making his way along our row of workers. His steps were deliberate, each one measured and heavy with entitlement, and his eyes scanned the field with a cold detachment that rendered him all but superhuman in our eyes. For a moment, as he halted to offer a curt nod of disapproval at our perceived inefficiency, I allowed myself to muse on the inherent absurdity of it all. Here was a being, utterly convinced of his own grandeur, who could barely fathom the daily reality of our toil, a reality in which every stone chipped away and every drop of sweat spilled was a quiet act of defiance against a system that sought to reduce us to mere instruments of force. Over time, amid the relentless routine and the ever-present specter of our captor's wrath, I began to accumulate memories of a different sort. They were fragments glimmering through the haze of exhaustive labor, moments when, despite it all, a sense of mutual respect and understated humor burgeoned in our hearts. I recall one instance when a particularly stupid command caused a minor mishap in the arrangement of our workspace, leading to a comically misplaced pile of stones that, under the indifferent gaze of our overseers, resembled nothing short of a modern art installation. The absurdity of the situation sparked a muted fit of laughter among us, as we silently communicated our shared exasperation. In those minutes, replete with the strained humor of those who have seen too much sorrow to be overwhelmed entirely, I felt a flicker of hope, an acknowledgement that no matter how oppressive the conditions, there was room for a human moment of levity in even the bleakest of circumstances. I came eventually to learn that our suffering was as much a part of the land as the rocky outcrops and the perennial unyielding wind. Like the rough terrain beneath my feet, our lives were marked by obstacles that could rarely be surmounted and by a pervading sense of inevitability that settled in the quiet hours before dawn. And yet, within that seemingly immutable structure, there existed a resilience born of repetition and quiet perseverance. I began to regard each day as a continuous thread in a vast, strangely interconnected tapestry, one that, despite its grim hues, was knitted together by moments of subtle beauty and the camaraderie of those who shared my fate. In those long, unchanging months, the boundaries between personal pain and collective endurance blurred into a single, persistent ache. I found myself reflecting on the nature of power and submission, on the ways in which the grand designs of our tormentors seemed to hinge on the small, daily acts of service that defined our existence. Every groan as the hammer struck stone, every shudder of body when the overseer's glare fell upon us, and every whispered joke shared in the shadows of our meager shelters were both a reminder of our subjugation and, paradoxically, an affirmation of our unquenchable spirit. There was an odd comfort in the regularity of it all, a reassurance that, irrespective of the capricious whims of fate, at least the cycle of labor and rest was constant. I became intimately acquainted with the minutiae of our environment, learning to discern the subtle interplay of sounds and shades in a place that offered little by way of natural warmth. The rasp of the wind against the metal of our crude tools and the soft murmur of our conversations beneath the starlight became a lullaby of sorts, a gentle accompaniment to nights filled with dreams of distant, kinder lands. I would often find my thoughts drifting to a time before I had become ensnared in this ceaseless cycle, a time when the forest was alive with rustling leaves, and the night air was filled with the chirping of creatures far less burdened by the weight of existence. In the quiet solitude of those memories, I discovered that even in the harshest of circumstances, there remained a place, however small, for beauty and hope. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, until the passage of time itself began to feel like a slow, meandering river. Each moment a droplet in a current that carried with it both the weight of sorrow and the faint glimmer of endurance. I often found myself pausing amidst the monotony, glancing at the horizon as if it might yield some secret message or sign that change was near. In these reflective pauses, I began to realize that our lot in life, severe though it was, had woven us together into a tapestry of shared experience, each thread a small act of survival, each interstice a memory of a time when we dared to laugh despite the odds. It would be naive to say that I ever dreamed of heroic rebellion or grand escape from the clutches of our relentless masters. Such thoughts, once the fuel for many a whispered conversation among the Orcs, gradually gave way to a quieter form of acceptance, a mindful understanding that our lives, measured in forced labor and punctuated by the meddlesome interventions of wizards and capricious commands of warlords, were a study in perseverance. I learned to find solace in the ordinary, the slow rhythm of a day spent under a pale sun, and the tender shared humor that blossomed in the darkness of night. That humor was not the boisterous kind known to some, but rather a gentle, knowing smile exchanged at the absurdity of it all, a silent, even if ironic, acknowledgement that life, in all its tragic monotony, still offered the possibility of quiet beauty. In the later years of my enslavement, when the dust of countless days had settled so thoroughly upon my shoulders that I sometimes forgot the warmth of a free dawn, it was the recurring details of our existence that sustained me. The memory of a raindrop tracing a slow path down a rugged cheek of stone, the sound of wind rattling through a crevice in the barracks, or the soft murmur of a companion drifting off to slumber. All these minutiae became the compass by which I navigated the labyrinth of my own thoughts. I grew to appreciate the intricate balance between pain and pleasure, captivity and fleeting freedom, understanding that even in the midst of enforced servitude, there lay a quiet revolution of spirit. It was a revolution not marked by the clashing of swords or the roar of battle, but by the slow, persistent act of remembrance, the very act of cherishing a memory of something beautiful, in a place where beauty seemed, at best, an occasional interloper. The obscure interventions of wizards, too, left their mark on my journey. Their sporadic appearances, full of cryptic admonitions and peculiar rituals, often unsettled us as much as they amused us. I remember one such wizard who, after a particularly arduous day, took it upon himself to deliver a lecture on the transcendence of suffering, as though it were an art form to be mastered by those destined for greatness. His words, laden with the kind of mystic jargon that might have inspired a throng of fervent believers, fell on ears too tired and hearts too burdened to be swayed. And yet, as I listened to him pace in a manner that suggested he was both above us and intimately bound to our fate, I could not help but see a trace of irony in his fervor. He spoke of destiny as if it were a gentle stream guiding us toward an unfathomable purpose, but in the harsh reality of our existence, destiny seemed as remote and unattainable as the distant glimmer of a free, unburdened life. As the years lengthened my service, I came to regard each day's labor as a measured meditation on endurance, a labor of body and spirit that demanded both quiet resignation and resilient hope. In those endless hours beneath a sky that offered little mercy, I discovered that even the simplest act of lifting a hammer or guiding a chisel could become an exercise in mindfulness. I began to see my work not merely as forced servitude, but as an unspoken dialogue with the raw elements of the world. A dialogue in which every strike upon the rock was a subdued affirmation of my will to exist against all odds. In the slow cadence of each task, I heard a rhythm that spoke of ancient, unyielding truths, that even in the deepest darkness there is the promise of a gentle luminescence, and that the human, or perhaps In our case, Orcish, spirit is capable of finding beauty in the act of simply enduring. In the quiet moments before sleep, when I lay my heavy head upon a rough-hewn pillow and allowed the memories of the day to wash over me like a slow tide, I would reflect on the countless faces of those around me, each one etched with lines of fatigue and the faint glimmer of defiance. Together we bore the strange burden of being instruments in a vast, uncaring mechanism. Yet in that shared fate, there emerged a sense of unity that transcended the confines of our suffering. It was in those moments, as the night deepened and the murmurs of my companions became a soft, lulling symphony, that I allowed myself to believe, however faintly, that our collective endurance was, in itself, a quiet act of liberation. In time, as autumn's chill yielded gradually to the bitter cold of winter, and the hearths of our makeshift camps burned low against the creeping darkness, the monotony of our daily tasks began to assume a rhythm that was almost comforting in its consistency. I found that even the most grueling labor could be punctuated by small, unexpected revelations, a perfectly shaped shard of granite that reminded me of a long-lost face, the way a stray beam of moonlight fell upon a worker's weary eyes, or the irony of a wizard's daytime sermon about the cyclical nature of fate. Each of these moments, insignificant in isolation, wove together a tapestry of experience that was in its own quiet way testament to the human capacity to adapt, to find tenderness amid cruelty, humor in despair. Now, as I speak these recollections in the soft cadence of a bedtime story meant to lull even the most troubled mind into a state of drowsy reflection, I realize that the long years of forced labor and the ceaseless presence of imperious wizards and tyrannical warlords have left an indelible mark upon my soul. Every day spent under the stern gaze of those who imposed order, every moment of private rebellion in the shape of a quiet chuckle or a fleeting thought of escape, has forged a narrative that is both haunting and, in its own understated elegance, beautiful. I have come to understand, through years of measured endurance, that even in a world governed by cruelty and modest indignities, there lies a gentle power in remembering the small fragments of goodness, however unexpected, that seep through the cracks of our constructed prisons. This narrative, as long as the nights I've spent under the indifferent stars, and as measured as the slow carving of stone by calloused hands, is not meant to glorify suffering, nor to celebrate heroics in the face of oppression. Rather, it is to offer the weary traveler a kindred spirit adrift in the long hours before sleep, a reminder that within the depths of even the most monotonous or harsh existence, there exist moments of quiet significance. The forced labor that once stripped us of our aspirations was also, ironically, a force that honed our capacity to notice the subtle wonders of life. The soft glow of a fading sunset behind a distant ridge, the delicate pattern formed by dew on the rough surface of a rock, the minute way in which a whispered word of camaraderie could ripple through the still air of the night. Though I dwell on these memories with a sadness that is tempered by the gentle humor of recollection, I have come to see that my life, marked by the inevitability of hard labor and the intrusive eccentricities of those in power, was also a lesson in the art of perseverance. It was a slow, almost imperceptible awakening to the realization that even a life dictated by tyranny can harbor secret gardens of resilience and quiet, unexpected beauty. And so, as I now settle into the peaceful rhythms of a time when choice replaced compulsion, I cannot help but smile softly at the thought that, in the end, my story is not solely one of sorrow and forced servitude, but also an allegory of the subtle triumph of spirit over circumstance. I share these reflections with you now in the soft cadence of memory, a lullaby intended to ease your worries and remind you that even the most painstaking hours of labor can be transformed, in time, into treasured strands of an existence that was lived fully and endured with quiet dignity. I speak slowly, for the weight of each word is measured in years that have passed. And although my tone may seem droll and my observations modest, they come from a place of deep understanding, a recognition that the mundane details of life, the hard, unyielding tasks, and the persistent interference of lofty figures are by themselves a kind of gentle epic. As I close my eyes to conjure the fading images of those days, the memories of forced labor blend with the quiet murmurs of the wind and the soft cadence of distant laughter. I remember how, even when the harsh commands of warlords and the incessant pontificating of wizards threatened to shatter what little hope remained, the smallest of joys, a shared smile, the ingenious observation of a misplaced stone, the whispered recounting of an absurd tale, kindled a flame that defied the darkness. I have come to see that in our most humble moments there resided the seeds of future redemption, a slow and gentle reminder that the spirit, however bowed, may yet rise in subtle splendor. So I invite you, dear listener, to imagine with me a time and place. I recall a time, now distant and worn like the pages of an old ledger, when I was forced into labor under circumstances that seem, even in retrospect, rather absurd. My days passed slowly, marked by the clanging of metal and the dull thud of a heart weighed down by endless work. I was an orc, amid a sprawling saga, not of heroic deeds, but of drudgery that could humble even the most patient soul. It was in those times that I learned how the world, with all its wizards, often had a humorous way of complicating the mundane. I spent my waking hours hauling supplies, clearing dense underbrush, and occasionally polishing the armor of our illustrious, if somewhat pompous, overlords. Each task held a kind of relentless rhythm, as inevitable as the passing seasons. Despite the hardship, there was a gentle camaraderie among us laborers that made the days bearable. We exchanged quietly droll observations and trivial complaints, sometimes laughing at how an extra pinch of dust or the clumsy whisper of a distant spell might disturb our labors. In the soft twilight of our shared burdens, even a grumbled sigh could seem like a lullaby. It was not only the physical weight of our work that burdened us. The presence of wizards loomed large in our lives, and they brought with them an odd sort of vexation. They would wander among us with long, curling beards, and opinions as ancient as the mountains they claimed to study. Their spells sometimes misfired, leaving trails of glittering mishaps that interrupted our diligent routines. I recall one particular instance when a misplaced incantation turned a load of timber into a mildly inconvenient heap of smoke and sparks. The wizard merely muttered something about astral interference before moving on, leaving us to tidy up the chaos. Even the warlords, with their booming commands and relentless demands for efficiency, played their part in our daily tribulations. Though their orders were delivered with a threatening confidence, there was an undeniable predictability in their manner that eventually became a part of the background rhythm of our lives. I sometimes found, in a moment of quiet introspection, that the sheer repetitiveness of forced labor brought with it a peculiar kind of clarity. The world was vast and complicated, filled with unexpected turns, yet in that small corner of it, each chore was a simple, unvarnished slice of reality. Now, as I settle into the calm of recollection, my thoughts wander to those days with a serene acceptance. I speak softly of the hardships, of the annoying wizards and imperious warlords, for in the grand tapestry of time, even the smallest threads have their place. And though my tale might seem weary to some, it carries the gentle, unassuming whisper of an orc who learned to find beauty in the everyday, even in the midst of forced labor. I trudged laboriously, dodging wizards and tyrannical warlords. Break time. Over.